The richest woman in Seattle stood alone at the edge of the dance floor, while 200 guests pretended not to see her. Every man in that ballroom had money enough to buy the building they stood in, and not one of them would walk toward her. Then a waiter, nobody knew her name, even bothered to learn, crossed the marble floor in front of everyone. What happened next changed two lives forever. If you want to know how far this story will travel, hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and stay until the end. The rain had been falling over Seattle since 4 in the afternoon, a thin gray drizzle that turned the city's glass towers into smeared reflections of themselves, and Liam Brooks had been on his feet since noon. By the time the first town cars began pulling up outside the Hawthorne Grand Ballroom, his lower back had settled into a dull ache he'd stopped noticing months ago, the kind of pain that just became part of working 60-hour weeks for a paycheck that barely covered daycare and rent. He stood near the service entrance in his black vest and pressed white shirt, going over the seating chart one more time even though he'd already memorized it. Table 14, the Whitfield account. Table 3, the Hendersons, who tipped well and complained more. Table 1, the head table, reserved for names that made headlines, names that ran companies bigger than some countries' economies. Brooks. His supervisor, a wiry man named Dale Pruitt, who'd worked event coordination for the Hawthorne Group for 11 years and never let anyone forget it, snapped his fingers twice in front of Liam's face. "You hear me? Champagne service starts at the south entrance the second the doors open, not before. The fire marshal's here tonight, and I am not getting written up because some intern doesn't know how to pour." "I heard you," Liam said. "South entrance after doors, got it. And stay out of the main floor unless you're working a table. I don't want you anywhere near the donors unless you're carrying a tray." Dale's eyes flicked over him, the kind of look that cataloged a person and dismissed them in the same glance. "This is the Hawthorne Legacy Gala, not some county fair. People here are worth more than this whole building." Liam didn't answer. He'd learned a long time ago that answering back never improved anything. It just gave men like Dale more reasons to remember your name for the wrong reasons. He thought about Maddie instead. His daughter, 6 years old, probably already asleep at Mrs. Alvarez's house down the hall from their apartment, curled up with the stuffed rabbit that used to be white before 2 years of love turned it gray. He thought about the look on her face that morning when he told her he had a big important job tonight, helping rich people have a fancy party, and she'd asked him, completely serious, if he was going to dance. "Daddies don't dance at work, baby," he'd told her, tying his shoes by the door. "That's sad," she'd said, and gone back to her cereal like she'd settled the matter. He smiled now, remembering it, and the smile was still on his face when the first guests started arriving. Men in tuxedos that cost more than his monthly salary, women wrapped in furs and diamonds that caught the chandelier light and threw it back in fractured little explosions across the marble floor. The Hawthorne Grand Ballroom was the kind of room built specifically to remind people they were small. 40-foot ceilings, crystal chandeliers the size of small cars, gold leaf on the crown molding that someone had probably spent a fortune restoring, just so it would look exactly as old and important as the people standing beneath it. Liam picked up his tray and started working the floor exactly the way he was supposed to. For the first hour, it was the usual rhythm: pour, smile, step back, repeat. He recognized some of the faces from financial news segments he caught in the break room sometimes. A senator's wife, the owner of a shipping conglomerate, 2 tech founders who'd apparently decided their feud was over for one night in the name of good publicity. He kept his eyes down, his tray steady, his voice pleasant and forgettable. That was the job. Be useful. Be invisible. It was nearly 9 o'clock when the orchestra shifted from the soft dinner music into something with more weight to it. A slow waltz that pulled couples toward the center of the floor like the room itself had exhaled. Liam was refilling glasses near the west wall when he noticed the woman standing alone near the tall windows. He knew who she was before anyone told him. Everyone in Seattle knew who she was. Evelyn Harrington stood with her back almost, but not quite, to the room, one hand resting against the cool glass, looking out at the rain-streaked skyline instead of at the 300 people behind her. She wore a deep emerald gown that probably cost more than Liam made in a year. Her dark hair swept back and pinned with something that glittered faintly under the light. And on the right side of her face and down along her jaw and neck, visible even from across the room, was the scarring. Old, healed, but unmistakable. the kind of scar tissue that told a story everyone in this room already knew and nobody had the nerve to ask her about directly. 5 years ago, Evelyn Harrington had pulled a 7-year-old boy out of a burning car on I-5 after a tanker truck collision turned the freeway into a wall of fire. She'd been driving home from a board meeting. She wasn't trained for it, wasn't equipped for it, didn't think about it. She'd just stopped her car, run toward the wreck while everyone else ran away, and pulled a stranger's child out through a window before the flames reached the gas tank. The boy lived. Evelyn spent 4 months in a burn unit and came out a different woman in more ways than the obvious one. She still ran Harrington Global. She was still, by most measures, one of the most powerful businesswomen in the country. But she didn't go to galas anymore. She didn't pose for photographs. She gave interviews by phone, when she gave them at all, and tonight was apparently the first public appearance she'd made in over a year. A fact Liam only knew because Dale had mentioned it earlier with the kind of breathless self-importance reserved for gossip about the rich. "She's only here because it's her family's foundation gala," Dale had said, refilling ice buckets. "Don't stare at her. Seriously, Brooks, I mean it. Don't stare, don't talk to her, don't even look at her too long. She doesn't like it." Liam hadn't planned on staring, but he watched now, almost without meaning to, as 3 different men who'd spent the last hour laughing too loud and shaking hands too hard, men who clearly understood the unspoken economics of a room like this, drifted toward Evelyn Harrington and then, at the last possible second, veered away. One pretended to spot a colleague across the room. Another suddenly remembered something urgent on his phone. A third simply slowed his steps until the moment passed and he could change direction without it looking deliberate. Nobody asked her to dance. Evelyn didn't move. She kept her eyes on the rain and her hand on the glass, and if she noticed the small, cowardly choreography happening behind her, the men changing course, the conversations that quieted slightly when she was nearby and picked back up once she wasn't, she gave no sign of it. But Liam noticed something else, something that made his chest tighten in a way he didn't examine too closely. The careful, practiced stillness of someone who had decided a long time ago not to expect anything different. "Brooks," Dale's voice, low and sharp, right behind him. "Table 9 needs water glasses. Move." Liam moved. He refilled water glasses at table 9 and then table 10, and he told himself it wasn't his business, that he had a job to do and a daughter to feed and absolutely no reason to involve himself in whatever quiet humiliation was unfolding by the windows. He told himself that for almost 20 minutes, through 2 more songs, while Evelyn Harrington stood in the same spot, and the dance floor filled and emptied and filled again around her like she was a stone in a river nobody wanted to touch. Then the orchestra started a new piece, slower this time, a waltz with a melody that climbed and then settled, the kind of song that made the whole room soften a little. And Liam looked over and saw her shift her weight, just slightly, like she was preparing to do something. Leave the floor entirely, find an excuse, disappear into a side room until the dancing was over, and she could rejoin the evening without anyone noticing she'd never been asked. And something in Liam, something stubborn and tired and maybe a little reckless, something that had nothing to do with being smart about his job and everything to do with being his daughter's father, made the decision before his brain finished arguing against it. He set his tray down on the nearest empty table. "Brooks," Dale's voice cracked across the room like a whip. "What are you doing? Brooks!" Liam didn't look back. He walked across the ballroom floor, past tables full of people who paid more for their seats than he paid in rent, past the orchestra, past Dale's furious whisper shouting that he could hear even over the music, and he kept walking until he was standing in front of Evelyn Harrington. Up close, the scarring was more visible. The skin along her jaw pulled tighter in places, the texture changed, a permanent record written into her face by fire. But her eyes, when she turned to look at him, were sharp and dark and entirely unbothered by his approach, like she'd simply been waiting to see what this particular stranger wanted before deciding whether he was worth her attention. "Can I help you?" Her voice was even. Not unkind exactly, just guarded, the voice of a woman who'd learned to expect the worst from people's curiosity. The whole ballroom had gone quiet around them. Not silent. The orchestra still played, the murmur of 300 conversations still hummed underneath everything. But quiet, in the way a room goes quiet, when enough people notice the same thing at the same moment. Liam could feel the attention land on him like a physical weight. He could feel Dale somewhere behind him, probably calculating exactly how fast he could fire a server in the middle of a black tie gala without causing a scene. He didn't let himself think about any of it. "I know I'm not supposed to be over here," Liam said. "I'm staff. I should be filling water glasses. But I've been watching this floor for 20 minutes, and every man in this room who's danced tonight has danced with someone. And you've been standing here the whole time, and I figured—" He stopped, recalibrated, started again, because this wasn't the kind of thing you said smoothly even when you meant it. "I figured somebody should ask. So, would you like to dance?" For a moment, nothing happened. Evelyn Harrington looked at him the way she might look at an unexpected number on a financial report, like she was checking it twice, certain there had to be an error somewhere. "Do you know who I am?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Do you know I could have you fired in the next 10 minutes if I wanted to?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then why would you risk that?" Liam thought about Maddie asleep down the hall in Mrs. Alvarez's apartment, the stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, and he thought about every time in his life someone had decided he wasn't worth the trouble of being seen. Every job interview where his resume got set aside because there were gaps in it from the year after his wife died. Every landlord who looked at a single father with a 6-year-old and saw a liability instead of a man trying his best. He thought about how it felt to stand in a room and have people's eyes slide past you like you were furniture. "Because nobody else was going to," he said simply, "and that didn't seem right to me." Somewhere behind him, he heard Dale make a small, strangled sound. Evelyn Harrington studied him for a long moment, long enough that Liam started to genuinely wonder if he'd just ended his employment with a single sentence, long enough that the song nearly finished without an answer at all. And then, just as the melody began to swell toward its close, she set down the champagne glass she'd been holding untouched for the better part of an hour and held out her hand. "All right," she said, "but if you step on my feet, I will absolutely have you fired." "Fair enough," Liam said, and felt something in his chest loosen for the first time all night. He took her hand. It was steady, her grip sure, the hand of a woman who'd spent 30 years in boardrooms, learning never to let anyone see her hesitate. He placed his other hand carefully at her waist, the way he remembered from his cousin's wedding 8 years ago, the last time he'd danced with anyone. And the orchestra started a new song before either of them could think too hard about what was happening. They moved together, awkwardly at first. Liam was no dancer, hadn't pretended to be one, and he stepped wrong twice in the first 30 seconds before finding something resembling rhythm. And across the ballroom, 300 conversations went quiet at almost the exact same moment. Liam was aware of it, the way you're aware of weather changing. A pressure shift in the room, heads turning, hands pausing mid-gesture. He didn't look around to confirm it. He kept his eyes on Evelyn, on the careful neutrality in her expression that was very slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to crack. "They're all staring," she said quietly, not quite meeting his eyes. "Let them." "You don't understand what you've done." "I asked a woman to dance," Liam said. "I think I understand exactly what I've done." Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, not yet, but the ghost of one, the muscle memory of an expression she hadn't used in a long time. "You're either very brave or very stupid." My daughter would say both. She's 6. She's usually right about things. That got something closer to a real reaction, a small huff of breath that might have been the beginning of a laugh, quickly suppressed but not quite hidden. "You have a daughter." "Maddie, she's the reason I'm working a wedding cake job at this hotel instead of doing something that pays better. Childcare's expensive. Flexible hours matter more than a higher rate." He didn't know why he was telling her this. A stranger, a billionaire, a woman whose name he'd only ever seen attached to 9-figure acquisitions in news headlines. Maybe it was easier to talk about Maddie than to talk about the fact that every person in this room was watching them like they were a car accident nobody could look away from. "Her mom passed away a few years back. It's just us now." Evelyn's hand tightened slightly on his shoulder. "I'm sorry." "Me too." He turned her gently, following the music, and for a moment neither of them said anything, just moved together under the chandeliers while the rest of the ballroom watched, in a silence that had stopped being about scandal and started being about something else entirely, something closer to held breath. "Why did you really do this?" Evelyn asked, finally, her voice lower now, meant only for him. And don't tell me it's because nobody else asked. Plenty of brave men in this room could have asked. They didn't. You did. Why? Liam considered the question seriously because it deserved a serious answer. I watched my wife get sick for 2 years before she died, he said. Toward the end, people stopped looking at her like she was a person. They looked at her like she was already gone, like there was no point getting close to something that wasn't going to last. It used to make me so angry I couldn't see straight, like dying made her worth less while she was still right there. Still her, still laughing at my terrible jokes 3 days before the end. He paused, found Evelyn's eyes, held them. I don't know your story. I don't need to. But I watched this whole room decide you weren't worth the risk of being close to, and it made me angry in that same exact way. So I crossed the floor. That's the whole reason. It's not complicated. Evelyn Harrington, 55 years old, CEO of a company worth more than some nations' annual budgets, survivor of a fire that should have killed her, and a recovery that had nearly broken her in different ways, looked at this 32-year-old waiter with his cheap rented vest and his exhausted eyes and his complete lack of strategy, and felt something move in her chest that she hadn't let herself feel in 5 years. She smiled. It wasn't practiced. It wasn't the careful board meeting smile she'd perfected for cameras before the accident and abandoned afterward because cameras made everything about the scars instead of the smile. It was real and a little surprised at itself, and it changed her whole face in a way that made several people near the edge of the dance floor actually stop talking entirely. Nobody said something like that to me in a very long time, she said. Maybe nobody's been paying attention, Liam said. They're lost. The song ended. The last notes faded into applause for the orchestra, and the ordinary noise of the ballroom began to creep back in, but slower than usual, like the room itself was reluctant to let the moment go. Liam stepped back and inclined his head, the same way he would for any guest, except his hands were trembling slightly, and his heart was going faster than it had any right to. Thank you for the dance, he said. Thank you for the courage, Evelyn replied. It's rarer than people think. Liam turned to go back to work, already bracing for the conversation he knew was coming with Dale, already running through what he'd say to keep his job, what he'd tell Maddie if he lost it, how he'd explain to a 6-year-old that her father had gotten fired for dancing with a CEO at a fancy party. He'd made it 3 steps when Evelyn's voice stopped him. Wait. He turned back. What's your name? Liam, he said. Liam Brooks. She nodded slowly, like she was committing it to memory with the same precision she probably used for 9-figure contracts. Thank you, Liam Brooks, she said. I think you may have just done something I haven't been able to do for myself in 5 years. What's that? Reminded me that I'm still in the room, she said, even when people pretend I'm not. Liam didn't entirely know what to say to that, so he said nothing, just gave her a small nod and walked back toward the service entrance, aware of every eye on him the whole way, aware of Dale standing rigid by the kitchen doors with an expression somewhere between fury and disbelief, aware that he had absolutely no idea what he'd just set in motion, what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, standing there in his rented vest with his pulse still hammering from a 3-minute dance with a stranger, was that Evelyn Harrington had spent the last 5 years building higher and higher walls around herself, one public appearance at a time, one canceled event at a time, one mirror avoided at a time, until she'd nearly convinced herself that the woman she used to be, confident, visible, unafraid of a room, was simply gone, burned away along with the skin on the right side of her face. And he didn't know that somewhere underneath the practiced composure she wore like armor, something in her had just cracked open for the first time in half a decade. Not because of pity, not because of charity, but because a tired single father with nothing to gain and everything to lose had looked across a room full of people who had decided she was too complicated to approach and decided she was worth the risk anyway. Dale was waiting for him by the kitchen doors, arms crossed, jaw tight. My office, tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. sharp. His voice was clipped, furious, the voice of a man already composing the termination paperwork in his head. I don't even know what that was, Brooks, but you do not put your hands on a guest. You do not approach the Harrington table, and you absolutely do not. I know, Liam said quietly. I'll be there at 8. He picked his tray back up off the table where he'd abandoned it. and he finished his shift exactly the way he'd started it, pouring water, clearing plates, staying out of the way, except now there was a strange, unfamiliar feeling sitting in his chest, something he couldn't quite name. Not pride, exactly, not relief. Something closer to the feeling of having done one small true thing in a long string of days that mostly asked him to be invisible. Across the room, through the rest of the evening, he caught glimpses of Evelyn Harrington in conversation. Actual conversation, the kind with eye contact and small gestures and, once, even a real laugh that carried halfway across the ballroom before she seemed to catch herself and quiet it down. People who had avoided her an hour earlier were suddenly finding reasons to approach. It was as though Liam's 3 minutes on the dance floor had given everyone else permission to do what they'd been too cowardly to do on their own. He didn't think much of it at the time. He was thinking about his alarm clock, set for 5:30 the next morning, so he could get Maddie ready for kindergarten before his 8 a.m. meeting with Dale. A meeting he fully expected to end with him cleaning out his locker and trying to figure out how to explain a sudden job loss to a landlord who'd already warned him twice about late rent. By the time the gala ended near midnight, the rain had stopped, and Liam walked 4 blocks to the bus stop in his thin work jacket because he couldn't afford the parking garage rate, replaying the whole strange evening in his head. The silence when he crossed the floor, the warmth of Evelyn's hand in his, the way her face had changed when she smiled like she meant it. He told himself it didn't matter. Tomorrow he'd probably lose his job, and none of it would matter at all. He had no way of knowing that across town, in the back seat of a town car gliding through wet, empty streets, Evelyn Harrington was staring out the window with an expression her driver hadn't seen on her in years, and that before she'd even reached her apartment, she'd already made a phone call that would change the next chapter of Liam Brooks's life completely. "Get me everything you can find on a member of tonight's catering staff," she told her assistant, her voice quiet but absolutely certain. "His name is Liam Brooks. I want to speak with him tomorrow." She hung up, leaned her head back against the seat, and for the first time in 5 years, let herself feel something that wasn't dread about the morning ahead. Liam's alarm went off at 5:30, and for a moment he lay still in the dark, staring at the water stain on his ceiling that had been slowly spreading since the winter rain started, trying to convince himself the night before had actually happened. Then Maddie's door creaked open down the hall, small feet padding across the floor, and he had exactly 4 seconds to compose himself before she climbed onto his bed. "Did you dance?" she asked immediately, like she'd been holding the question all night. "What?" "You said daddies don't dance at work. Did you dance?" He looked at her, her hair a wild tangle from sleep, her eyes already bright and curious in the way they only were before the world had asked anything of her yet. And he laughed, short and disbelieving, because of course she'd remember. Of course the one thing his daughter would care about was the one thing he wasn't sure how to explain. "Yeah, baby, I did." Maddie's whole face lit up like he'd told her Christmas had moved to a Tuesday in October. "I knew it. Was she pretty?" "She was," Liam said, and didn't elaborate because he didn't entirely understand yet what he meant by it. He got her dressed, got her fed, dropped her at Mrs. Alvarez's with a kiss on the top of her head and a promise to be back by mid-morning, and then he caught the 7:15 bus downtown with a knot sitting low in his stomach the whole ride. He kept rehearsing what he'd say to Dale. He kept landing on nothing that sounded like it would matter. The Hawthorne Grand staff entrance smelled like bleach and old coffee at 8 in the morning, nothing like the perfume and candle wax of the night before. Dale was already in his cramped office when Liam knocked, sitting behind a desk covered in invoices, and he didn't look up right away. "Sit," Dale said. Liam sat. "You know what I had to deal with after you walked off the floor last night?" Dale finally raised his eyes. 3 different board members from the Hawthorne Group asking me who you were. The hotel manager calling me at 11:30 at night wanting to know if we had a lawsuit on our hands. I had half a mind to walk over there myself and pull you off that floor by your collar. "I understand if you need to let me go," Liam said quietly. He'd practiced saying it without his voice shaking and mostly succeeded. Dale stared at him for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. Not quite warmth. Dale didn't really do warmth, but something adjacent to grudging respect. "I'm not firing you, Brooks." Liam blinked. "What?" "I said I'm not firing you, mostly because I got a call this morning before you even walked in here." Dale slid a piece of paper across the desk, a phone message scrawled in his own cramped handwriting. "Harrington Global. Evelyn Harrington's office. They want you at their headquarters by 10 o'clock. Asked specifically for you by name. He shook his head like the whole situation offended some deep professional principle he couldn't quite name. In 11 years of this job, I've never once had a CEO's office call about a server. So I don't know what happened on that dance floor last night, but apparently it wasn't nothing. Liam looked down at the paper, at the address written there. A building he'd walked past 100 times and never once imagined setting foot inside. And felt the knot in his stomach loosen into something stranger, something closer to disbelief. Go home. Change into something that isn't a uniform, Dale said, standing, already moving back into his usual brisk efficiency, like the moment of almost kindness had embarrassed him. And Brooks, whatever this is, don't screw it up. People like her don't usually give second looks to people like us. Don't waste it. By 9:45, Liam was standing in the lobby of Harrington Tower in the only decent shirt he owned, feeling smaller than he had in years. The building rose 40 stories above the Seattle waterfront, all glass and steel and quiet. Expensive hush. The kind of place where the air itself seemed to cost money. A receptionist with a headset and a practiced smile checked his name against a list, looked mildly surprised to find it there, and directed him to the executive elevator. The ride to the 40th floor took 11 seconds and felt like an hour. Evelyn Harrington's assistant met him at the elevator doors, a sharp, efficient woman named Carol, who introduced herself with a handshake and walked fast enough that Liam had to lengthen his stride to keep up. Ms. Harrington doesn't usually take meetings before noon, Carol said, like this was important context he needed. She moved her entire morning around for you. I don't understand why, Liam admitted. Carol gave him a look he couldn't quite read. You will. Evelyn's office occupied the corner of the building, floor-to-ceiling windows on two sides looking out over Elliott Bay, the water gray and restless under a sky that hadn't decided yet whether to rain again. She was standing at the window when Carol showed him in, dressed today in a simple charcoal suit, her hair down instead of pinned up the way it had been the night before, and for a moment Liam was struck by how different she looked without the armor of a gala gown and a room full of strangers watching her. Younger, somehow, despite the gray threading through her dark hair, more like a person and less like a headline. Mr. Brooks, she said, turning. Thank you for coming on short notice. Wasn't really in a position to say no, Liam said, then immediately worried it sounded rude. I mean, I was curious and nervous, mostly nervous. That earned him the ghost of last night's smile. Sit, please. He sat in one of the two chairs facing her desk, and she took the other instead of sitting behind the desk itself, which struck him as deliberate, like she didn't want there to be a wall of mahogany between them. I'll be direct, Evelyn said. I don't often do this. I want you to understand that going in because I don't want you to think this is something I do casually. She folded her hands in her lap. Last night, you did something nobody in that ballroom had the courage to do in 5 years. You looked at me and saw a person instead of a liability or a cautionary tale or a story everyone already knows the ending to. I haven't forgotten what that felt like, even overnight, even after everything else that happened at that gala. I don't intend to forget it. I just asked you to dance, Liam said. I don't think it was as big as everyone's making it out to be. It was exactly as big as everyone's making it out to be, Evelyn said, a little sharply, and then seemed to catch the edge in her own voice and softened it. I'm sorry. It's just, you don't know what it's like to watch a room decide you for them, to have people make 100 small calculations about your worth before you've said a single word. You did the opposite of that. You didn't calculate anything. You just walked over. She paused. I want to offer you a position. Liam sat very still. A position. The Harrington Foundation runs our philanthropic arm, burn survivor programs, emergency responder support, family assistance for people who've lost everything in fires, accidents, disasters. It's meaningful work, and it's chronically understaffed, because most people who could do it well want corporate salaries and corner offices instead. Evelyn studied him for a moment. I watched you last night. You didn't see a scarred woman standing alone at a party. You saw someone the room had decided to ignore, and it bothered you enough to do something about it, even at personal cost to yourself. That instinct, that's exactly what this foundation needs more of. I think you'd be extraordinary at this work. I don't have a background in nonprofit management, Liam said carefully. I don't have a college degree. I worked construction for 6 years before my wife got sick, and after that I just took whatever job let me be home for my daughter at night. None of that is a problem I'm worried about, Evelyn said. I have an entire floor of people with master's degrees who can teach you spreadsheets and grant compliance in a month. What I can't teach is what you already have. The ability to look at someone broken and not flinch. The ability to see dignity where other people see damage. Her voice had gone quieter, more careful. I built this foundation because I know what it's like to be the person nobody knows how to look at anymore. I need someone running our survivor programs who understands that in his bones, not from a textbook. Liam thought about Maddie, about rent, about the look on Dale's face that morning, about the precariousness of a life built on hourly wages and luck. He thought about his wife in her last weeks, the way people had stopped meeting her eyes, the way he'd promised himself he'd never let another person feel that small if he could help it. What's the pay? He asked, because it mattered, because pretending it didn't would have been a lie. Evelyn named a figure that made him go quiet for a full 5 seconds, nearly triple what he made now, with benefits, with actual stability, with a schedule that Evelyn assured him would flex around his daughter's needs without question. Why? Liam finally asked. Why me, specifically? You could hire anyone. You could hire someone with the degree and the spreadsheets and the experience. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, looking out at the gray water beyond the glass. 5 years ago, after the accident, my own board hired a public relations consultant to help manage how I was perceived, she said. Do you know what his first piece of advice was? Stay out of public view until the scarring fades, or until people forget what you used to look like. He said it like it was practical advice, like it wasn't asking me to disappear. Her jaw tightened slightly. I took it. For 5 years, I took it. I let a stranger's discomfort dictate how visible I was allowed to be in my own life. Last night, you reminded me what it felt like to refuse that. I don't want to lose that feeling again, and I think having you nearby doing work that matters would help me hold on to it. It was the most honest thing Liam had heard a powerful person say to him in his entire life. Okay, he said, I'll take it, on one condition. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. You're negotiating with me. My daughter comes first, always. If she's sick, if there's a school thing, if she just needs me. That's not negotiable, no matter what's happening at the office. Mr. Brooks, Evelyn said, something almost amused in her voice, I would be deeply disappointed in you if you'd agreed to anything less. He started the following Monday. The first few weeks were a blur of names and acronyms, and a learning curve steep enough that Liam went home most nights with his head spinning, reviewing grant applications and survivor intake forms at his kitchen table after Maddie went to bed. But underneath the unfamiliar paperwork was something he recognized immediately. People. Scared people, grieving people, people who'd lost homes and faces and futures to fire and disaster and bad luck, and who walked into the Harrington Foundation offices expecting to be processed like a case number, and instead found Liam Brooks sitting across from them, looking them directly in the eye, asking about their lives instead of just their losses. Word moved fast inside an organization that size. Within a month, the staff had started quietly redirecting the hardest cases to him. The survivors who'd shut down in every previous meeting, the ones who flinched at sympathy and bristled at pity. Liam didn't offer either. He offered something simpler, attention, without an agenda behind it. How do you do that? One of the program directors, a woman named Renata who'd worked at the foundation for 9 years, asked him one afternoon after he'd spent 40 minutes with a former firefighter who hadn't said more than 3 words to anyone since his accident, and walked out of Liam's office talking animatedly about wanting to mentor younger recruits. I've tried everything with that guy, therapists, support groups. He shuts down every time. I don't try to fix anything, Liam said. I just don't look away. That's it. That's the whole trick. Evelyn noticed it too. She made a habit in those early weeks of stopping by his office unannounced, ostensibly to check on his transition, though both of them understood fairly quickly that the visits had become about something more than oversight. She'd lean in his doorway with a cup of coffee and ask how a particular case was going, and the conversation would drift, the way conversations do between two people who are slowly becoming important to each other, into other things. His daughter's kindergarten teacher, Evelyn's early years building the company from a single Seattle office into a national name. The strange, specific loneliness of being a single parent. The strange, specific loneliness of being the only person in every room who looked like she did. "You're different around here than you were at the gala," Liam observed one evening. The two of them, the last ones on the floor, Evelyn perched on the edge of his desk going through a stack of program proposals he'd written. "More relaxed." "I'm always more comfortable in a building I own," Evelyn said dryly. Then, more seriously, "And I suppose I don't feel like I have to brace for anything here. People who work for me already know what I look like. There's nothing left to flinch about." "There was never anything to flinch about," Liam said, and meant it plainly, without performance, the way he said most things. "I think people flinch because they don't know what to say, not because of what they see. Cowardice dressed up as politeness." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that made Liam acutely aware of how close she was sitting, how the late afternoon light through the windows caught the scarring along her jaw and made it look less like damage and more like simply a fact of her face, no different than a freckle or a line from laughing too much. "You say things like that so easily," she said, "like it costs you nothing." "It doesn't," Liam said. "That's the part I don't think people understand. Treating someone like a person isn't expensive. It's free. Everyone acts like kindness is some scarce resource they have to ration, and it's not. It's the cheapest thing in the world. People are just scared of being the one who offers it first." 3 months into the job, Evelyn made her first public appearance since the gala. A ribbon cutting for a new burn treatment wing the foundation had funded at Seattle General, the kind of event she'd avoided for years, the kind of event that came with photographers and reporters and exactly the sort of scrutiny she'd spent half a decade hiding from. Liam stood near the back of the small crowd, not because he was needed there in any official capacity, but because Evelyn had asked him quietly the night before if he'd come. "Why?" he'd asked. "Because the last time I was in a crowded room, you were the only one who looked at me like I belonged in it," she'd said. "I'd like that to be true again." He watched her cut the ribbon, watched her give brief remarks about the families this new wing would serve, watched the cameras flash and the reporters scribble notes, and he watched her hands, which trembled almost imperceptibly through the entire thing. Except once, in the middle of her remarks, when her eyes found him at the back of the small crowd, and her hands steadied and her voice found its footing again. Afterward, in the car back to the office, she didn't say much. She sat with her head against the window, watching the city slide by, and Liam let the silence sit there without trying to fill it, because he'd learned by then that some of the most important moments with Evelyn Harrington happened in exactly that kind of quiet. "Thank you," she finally said. "For what?" "I didn't do anything." "You stood there," Evelyn said. "That was enough. That was—" Over the following weeks, the appearances continued. A hospital visit to a children's burn unit, where she sat at a 6-year-old patient's bedside for nearly an hour, comparing scars with quiet, matter-of-fact tenderness that left the child's mother in tears. A fundraising dinner for emergency responders, where she gave a speech that didn't shy away from her own accident for the first time in public. A community event in a working-class neighborhood outside Seattle, where she shook hands and listened to people's stories without a single member of the press present, because she'd specifically requested it stay that way. Each time, Liam was somewhere in the room, not because his job required it. Most of these events had nothing to do with his actual responsibilities, but because some unspoken agreement had formed between them, an understanding neither one had bothered to put into words, that Evelyn moved through the world a little more easily when she knew where he was standing. His relationship with Maddie noticed it too, in the small, observant way kids notice everything adults think they're hiding. "You talk about her a lot," Maddie said one night over dinner, swinging her feet under her chair, not looking up from her macaroni. "Who?" "The lady, from the dance, Evelyn." She said the name carefully, like she'd been practicing it. "Is she your friend now?" Liam considered the question more seriously than its size probably warranted. "Yeah," he said slowly. "I think she is. I think—" "Good," Maddie said, with the simple, unshakable confidence of a 6-year-old who'd already decided something was true. "You should bring her to my recital." He laughed, surprised, warmth spreading through his chest in a way that had nothing to do with the foundation or the salary or any of the practical things that had changed in the last 3 months. "Maybe someday, baby." What he didn't say, What he was only beginning to admit to himself in the quiet hours after Maddie went to bed, staring at the ceiling instead of sleeping, was that the warmth he felt when Evelyn Harrington walked into a room had stopped feeling like simple admiration somewhere in the last few weeks, and had started feeling like something with deeper roots, something he wasn't entirely sure either of them was ready to name. Evelyn, for her part, was discovering the same unsettling truth in her own way, in the way she found herself looking forward to Mondays for the first time in years, in the way she caught herself smiling at her phone over a text about Maddie's kindergarten art project, in the way the walls she'd spent 5 years building had, without her quite noticing when it happened, begun to come down one quiet conversation at a time. But not everyone watching Evelyn Harrington's gradual return to public life was happy about it. And as her visibility grew, so did the attention. Not all of it kind, not all of it harmless, and far more of it than either Evelyn or Liam was prepared for. It started small, the way most ugly things do. A photo from the hospital ribbon cutting made its way onto a financial news website, unflattering and poorly cropped, taken at an angle that caught the scarring on Evelyn's face in harsh fluorescent light. The article itself was neutral enough, a few paragraphs about the new burn wing and the foundation's expanded funding. But the comment section underneath it was not neutral. It was not anything close to neutral. Liam found out about it from Renata, who came into his office on a Tuesday morning with her phone already in her hand and an expression that told him whatever she was about to show him wasn't going to be good. "You should see this before she does," Renata said, "although I have a feeling she already has." The comments were the kind of casual cruelty that the internet made effortless, hundreds of strangers hiding behind usernames to say things they'd never say to a person's face. Comments about how a company that size shouldn't have a CEO who looked like that representing it in public. Comments speculating with grotesque specificity about what she must look like under her clothes. Comments calling her a publicity stunt, a charity case playing dress-up as a business leader, a woman who should have stayed home and let someone presentable run the company. Liam felt something cold and furious settle in his chest as he scrolled. Has she seen this? I don't know. But it's not just the comments, it's spreading. A finance blog picked it up this morning with the headline, "Is Harrington Global's image problem bigger than investors realize?" They're talking about her face like it's a balance sheet liability. He found her 20 minutes later in her office, door closed, the blinds drawn against the gray morning light in a way he'd never seen before. When he knocked and let himself in, she was sitting very still at her desk, her laptop open in front of her, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale. "You don't have to read that," Liam said quietly. "I already have." Her voice was flat, controlled in the particular way that meant she was holding something back by force. "Several times, actually. I have something of a gift for finding the worst version of myself in any room, real or digital." He pulled the second chair closer and sat down without being invited, which he wouldn't have done 3 months ago, before any of this had become familiar enough to allow. "It's not true. None of it." "It doesn't have to be true," Evelyn said. "It just has to be loud enough." She closed the laptop finally, with more force than necessary. "Do you know what my board called this morning? Concern." They expressed concern about my, and I'm quoting directly here, "increased public visibility and whether it's optimal for shareholder confidence at this time." She let out a short, humorless laugh. 5 years, Liam. 5 years I stayed home, stayed quiet, let them manage how visible I was allowed to be, and the one time I start showing up again, this is what it costs. That's not on you. That's on them. On everyone who decided your scars are more interesting to talk about than your leadership. It doesn't matter whose fault it is when I'm the one who has to sit in board meetings and listen to grown men in $2,000 suits debate with a straight face whether my face is bad for business. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, the first real crack he'd heard in months, and she pressed her lips together like she could physically hold the rest of it in. Liam didn't say anything for a moment. He'd learned over the past 3 months that Evelyn Harrington didn't respond well to reassurance offered too quickly. It felt to her like being managed, like one more person deciding how she should feel about her own life. So instead, he just sat with her in the dim office while the storm outside the window matched something in the room. "For what it's worth," he finally said, "I think you're the bravest person I've ever met. And I don't say that lightly. I watched my wife fight a disease that was going to win no matter what she did, every single day, for 2 years, without ever once feeling sorry for herself in front of me. I thought that was the bravest thing I'd ever see in my life. And then I watched you walk into a hospital wing full of cameras after 5 years of hiding, and I thought, okay, maybe there's a second kind. Evelyn's eyes were wet when she looked at him, though she didn't let the tears fall, blinking them back with the same iron discipline she probably used in every boardroom she'd ever sat in. You always know exactly what to say. No, I don't, Liam said honestly. I just say what's true and hope it lands somewhere useful. It didn't fix anything, not really. The comments stayed up, the finance blog ran a follow-up piece 2 days later that was somehow worse, and the board scheduled an emergency session for the following week to discuss what one member reportedly called the optics situation. But Evelyn seemed steadier after that conversation, like something in her had been propped back up, even if the underlying structure was still cracked. The board meeting, when it came, was the kind of ugly that didn't show up in any minutes or official record. Liam wasn't in the room. He had no reason to be. His job had nothing to do with corporate governance. But he was in the building, finishing a grant proposal 2 floors below, when Carol called him in a near panic and asked him to come up immediately. He found Evelyn in her office afterward. The meeting clearly just ended, sitting at her desk with her composure stretched thin enough that he could see straight through it for the first time since he'd known her. "They want me to step back," she said before he'd even closed the door. Not officially, nobody's stupid enough to say it on the record, but 3 board members suggested very delicately that I should consider reducing my public-facing role until the, and I'm quoting one of them directly, narrative settles. Her hands were shaking now, not the controlled tremor from the ribbon cutting, but something rawer. They want to put someone else in front of the cameras, someone more palatable. That was the word they used. Palatable. What did you tell them? I told them I'd think about it. Her voice broke on the last word, finally, completely, and she pressed both hands flat against the desk like she needed something solid to hold on to. Liam, I have run this company for 11 years. I built half of what it is today with my own hands, my own decisions, my own sleepless nights. And in one meeting, 5 men decided my face was a liability they needed to manage. Like I'm a recall, a defective product. Liam crossed the room and knelt by her chair, close enough that she had to look at him instead of past him. You're not a defective product, he said, low and fierce. You're the smartest, strongest person in that boardroom, and every single one of those men knows it, which is exactly why they're scared of you. Scared people attack what makes them afraid. That's all this is. It doesn't feel like that, Evelyn whispered. It feels like the accident all over again. Like I'm back in that hospital bed, looking in a mirror for the first time, except now it's not just my face. It's everything. My company, my voice, my place in the world I built. She finally let the tears fall, quiet and exhausted, the dam she'd been holding for days finally giving out. I don't know if I can do this again. It would have been easy, in that moment, to offer comfort that didn't mean anything. The kind of soft, useless reassurance people offer when they want a painful moment to end quickly. Liam didn't do that. He'd learned a long time ago, sitting in hospital rooms with his wife, that the worst thing you could give someone in real pain was a lie dressed up as kindness. Do you remember the gala? He asked instead. Evelyn looked up, startled by the shift. What? The gala. The night I crossed the floor. He held her gaze steady. You stood by that window for almost an hour while every coward in that room found a reason not to walk toward you. And you didn't leave. You didn't run to the bathroom and hide until the dancing was over, even though I bet some part of you wanted to. You stood there, in front of everyone, and you let yourself be seen, even when it would have been so much easier not to. His voice softened, but didn't lose its edge. That's the same woman sitting in front of me right now. The board didn't take that away from you. They're just hoping you've forgotten you have it. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, looking at him, something working behind her eyes. You think I should fight this? I think you should do whatever's true to who you are, Liam said, but I don't think hiding again is going to feel any better the second time than it did the first. She didn't answer right away. But 3 days later, an invitation crossed Liam's desk, for a national conference on burn recovery and trauma survivorship scheduled for the following month in Chicago, with thousands of survivors, medical professionals, and advocates expected to attend. Evelyn had been invited to give the keynote address months earlier, before any of the recent ugliness started, and the Foundation's communications team had quietly begun drafting language to politely decline on her behalf, assuming, correctly, until that point, that she'd want to step back from the spotlight rather than walk further into it. Evelyn rejected the draft decline with a single line in the margin. "I'm going. Write something new." The weeks leading up to the conference were tense in a way Liam hadn't experienced at the Foundation before. The board hadn't formally objected. Evelyn had made it clear, in a meeting Liam heard about secondhand, that this particular decision wasn't open for debate, but the undercurrent of disapproval followed her through every hallway conversation, every strained smile from executives who'd rather she disappear quietly than make a scene. The online attacks hadn't stopped either. If anything, word that she planned to appear publicly again, unflinching, seemed to provoke them further. Liam watched her prepare for the speech in the evenings, staying late at the office long after everyone else had gone home, drafting and discarding pages of remarks that all sounded, to her own ear, too careful, too managed, too much like the version of herself that had spent 5 years hiding. "I don't know how to write this," she admitted to him one night, nearly 11 o'clock, the two of them alone on the 40th floor with the city lights spread out below them like scattered stars. "Every version sounds like I'm apologizing for existing, or worse, like I'm performing courage instead of actually having it." "Then stop writing it," Liam said. "Just say what's true. That's the only speech that's ever worked for you." That's easy advice from someone who isn't the one standing on a stage in front of 3,000 people. "You're right," Liam admitted. "It is easy advice. Doesn't make it wrong, though." She looked at him for a long moment, something soft and unguarded passing over her face. "Will you come with me? To Chicago?" The question landed heavier than its size, and they both seemed to feel it at the same time. The way this had stopped, somewhere in the last 3 months, being purely about a job, or a foundation, or even gratitude for a single dance at a gala. It had become about something neither of them had said out loud yet, something that lived in the careful way they made space for each other. In the late nights at the office that had nothing to do with actual work. In the way Maddie had started asking, almost weekly now, when Evelyn was coming over for dinner again. "Yeah," Liam said, "I'll come with you." The conference hall in Chicago held just over 3,000 people, a sea of name badges and quiet conversation that hushed into anticipation as the morning's keynote approached. Liam sat in the third row, close enough to see Evelyn's hands trembling slightly as she gathered her notes backstage, close enough that when she glanced out at the crowd just before walking on, her eyes found him first. She walked onto the stage in a deep blue dress, her hair pinned back the way it had been the night of the gala, the scarring along her jaw fully visible under the bright stage lighting, with no scarf, no careful angle, no attempt at concealment. A ripple of low murmurs moved through the crowd, not unkind, mostly just surprised, the reaction of an audience that had clearly expected a more cautious version of this moment. She stood at the podium for a long moment before speaking, long enough that Liam felt his own chest tighten with worry. Then she set her prepared notes aside, untouched, and looked out at the crowd. "I had a speech written," Evelyn said, her voice steady despite everything. "My communications team spent 2 weeks on it. It talked about resilience and recovery and the Foundation's expanded programming, and it was probably very good. I'm not going to give it on." A few uncertain laughs rose from the crowd, the kind that come when an audience isn't sure yet whether to relax. "5 years ago, I pulled a 7-year-old boy out of a burning car on Interstate 5, Evelyn continued. "I don't remember deciding to do it. I just remember running. I remember the heat, and I remember not caring about the heat, because there was a child trapped in that car, and nobody else was moving fast enough. I got him out. He's 12 now. He plays baseball. I check in on his family every year, and every year I'm reminded that whatever this," she gestured to the right side of her own face without flinching, "cost me, it bought something worth infinitely more." The room had gone completely silent. "But here's what nobody tells you about surviving something like that," she went on. "Surviving the fire is the easy part, relatively speaking. What comes after is harder. Because the world doesn't quite know what to do with you anymore. People's eyes do this thing. You'll all recognize it, I imagine, some of you better than I do, where they look at you for half a second and then very deliberately look somewhere else, like making eye contact with you cost them something. And for 5 years, I let that look win. I disappeared. I let other people manage how visible I was allowed to be, because it was easier than fighting for a version of myself that the world seemed determined to make small. Her eyes moved across the crowd, and Liam watched her find faces in the audience. Survivors, some in wheelchairs, some with scarring of their own, some with prosthetics, all of them leaning forward now, listening in a way that had nothing to do with politeness. A few months ago, someone reminded me what it felt like to be seen without flinching, Evelyn said, her voice catching slightly before steadying again. Not pitied, not stared at, seen, and it scared me more than the fire did, honestly, because being invisible was safe. Nobody could hurt what they'd already stopped looking at. She paused. But safe isn't the same as alive, and I'd spent 5 years confusing the two. She reached up, with a steadiness that surprised even Liam, and unpinned the silk scarf she'd worn looped loosely around her neck for the entire conference, setting it on the podium beside her notes. I'm 55 years old. I run a company that employs 11,000 people. I have scars on the right side of my face and down my neck that I got pulling a child out of a burning car, and I am done apologizing for the way that fire left its signature on my skin. If looking at me costs you something, I'd ask you to sit with that discomfort rather than asking me to disappear so you don't have to feel it. Because I promise you, every single person in this room who survived something that changed how they look has already paid a far higher price than the cost of your glance. The applause started slowly. A few people standing first, scattered through the crowd, and then more. And within a few seconds, the entire hall was on its feet, the sound of it rolling through the room like something physical. Liam stood with them, his throat tight, watching Evelyn Harrington stand at that podium with her scars fully visible and her shoulders square, looking, for the first time since he'd met her, completely and entirely unafraid. She found his eyes again in the crowd, and for just a moment, before the next wave of applause swallowed everything, she smiled. Not the careful, practiced smile of a CEO managing a room, but the real one, the one he'd first seen on a dance floor in Seattle, the one that belonged entirely to her. By the time they landed back in Seattle that night, the speech had already gone viral. Clips of it were circulating across every platform. The moment she removed her scarf replayed thousands of times within hours. News outlets that had spent the previous week speculating about her image problem now scrambling to run pieces about her courage instead. The same finance blog that had questioned whether she was bad for business published a hasty follow-up praising her as a new kind of corporate leadership. The board, predictably, said nothing publicly about reversing their earlier concerns, but the emergency meeting they'd scheduled to discuss her visibility quietly never happened. Evelyn didn't gloat about any of it. If anything, she seemed almost wary of the sudden reversal, as if she understood better than anyone how quickly public opinion could swing back the other way. But something in her had changed permanently in that conference hall in Chicago, something Liam could see in the way she carried herself afterward, straighter, steadier, less braced for impact. "Thank you," she told him on the flight home, her hand finding his on the armrest between them, neither of them quite acknowledging out loud what the gesture meant. "For Chicago, for all of it." "You did that yourself," Liam said. "I just reminded you that you already knew how." "That's not nothing," Evelyn said quietly. "That's actually everything." Outside the small airplane window, the lights of Seattle were just beginning to appear in the distance, and neither of them spoke again for a long while, content simply to sit there together, her hand still resting in his, both of them aware that whatever this was between them had stopped being something either of them could pretend not to see. The months that followed Chicago moved differently than the months before it, the way a river moves differently once it's broken through a dam. Evelyn's speech had been viewed by the Foundation's communications team's last count, somewhere north of 40 million times across every platform that mattered, and the requests started pouring in almost immediately. Interviews, op-ed invitations, speaking engagements from hospitals and universities and survivor networks across the country, all of them wanting a piece of the woman who'd stood on a stage and refused to apologize for her own face. Evelyn turned down most of them. The one she accepted, she chose with a deliberateness that told Liam she was relearning, slowly, how to be visible on her own terms instead of anyone else's. "I'm not interested in being a symbol," she told him one afternoon, going through a stack of requests Carol had printed and left on her desk. "I watched what happens to people who get turned into symbols. They stop being people. They become a story other people tell about themselves." She set the stack down, rubbing her temple. "I want this to be about the work, the programs, the actual people we're helping, not about a viral clip of me taking off a scarf." "Then make it about that," Liam said. "Nobody's forcing you to take every interview. Pick the ones that let you talk about the foundation instead of just your face." It became, in practice, exactly the kind of filter Evelyn needed. She accepted a profile in a major business magazine, but only on the condition that half the piece focus on the foundation's expanded burn treatment funding rather than her personal story. She gave a single network interview, choosing a reporter who'd lost her own father to a house fire years earlier, someone who asked questions that came from understanding instead of curiosity. She turned down 3 separate offers for a memoir, telling each publisher politely that her story wasn't finished enough yet to be packaged and sold. What she said yes to, almost without exception, was anything that put resources directly into the hands of survivors. Within 4 months of the Chicago speech, the Harrington Foundation had expanded its burn treatment partnerships to 6 new hospitals across the country, funded a scholarship program for the children of firefighters and emergency responders killed or permanently injured in the line of duty, and launched a peer mentorship network connecting newly injured survivors with people further along in their recovery. An idea Liam had pitched almost a year earlier, back when he was still learning the difference between a grant proposal and a budget memo, and which Evelyn had quietly greenlit without telling him until the funding was already approved. "You did this," Liam said, staring at the program outline she'd handed him. His name listed as founding director of what the internal memo was calling the Brooks Mentorship Initiative. "I funded an idea that was already good," Evelyn corrected. "You did the actual work of having it. You named it after me. I named it after the man who suggested that survivors needed someone further down the road showing them it gets easier, instead of just doctors telling them it will." She shrugged, a small private smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. It seemed fitting. The program grew fast, faster than either of them expected, because it turned out there was an enormous and previously unmet hunger among survivors for exactly this. Not therapy, not pity, just connection with someone who'd walked the same road and come out the other side functional, even happy. Liam spent his days now split between administrative work and something closer to what had drawn him into the field in the first place, sitting across from people in their worst moments and reminding them, simply by being present and unflinching, that worse moments don't have to be permanent ones. He still picked Maddie up from school every day at 3:15. He still made her breakfast every morning, still argued with her about vegetables, still read to her every night before bed, the same battered picture books they'd been working through for 2 years. The job had changed, the paycheck had changed, the entire shape of his professional life had changed almost beyond recognition, but the architecture of his actual life, the part that mattered most, stayed exactly as it had always been, built around a 6-year-old who was now closer to 7 and increasingly opinionated about everything from her hairstyle to her father's choice of friends. "You should marry Evelyn," Maddie announced one evening, completely without warning, while Liam was cutting her chicken into smaller pieces. He nearly dropped the knife. "Where did that come from?" "You smile different when she calls," Maddie said, matter of fact, the way only a 7-year-old could deliver something so precisely observed. "And she came to my recital. And she knows I don't like the crust on my sandwiches without me even telling her." She looked at him with the kind of patient seriousness kids reserve for explaining obvious things to slow adults. "That's basically the same as marrying her already. You're just not doing the paperwork part." Liam laughed, surprised into it, though something in his chest tightened around the truth buried inside his daughter's logic. Evelyn had come to Maddie's spring recital 2 months earlier, had sat in a folding chair in a school gymnasium that smelled like floor wax and nervous energy, surrounded by other parents who recognized her immediately and tried, with varying degrees of success, not to stare, and had clapped harder for Maddie's slightly off-rhythm tap routine than anyone else in the room. Afterward, she'd brought Maddie a small bouquet of flowers, the kind of gesture that cost almost nothing and meant almost everything, and Maddie had hugged her so hard Evelyn had laughed out loud. A real, unguarded sound Liam hadn't heard from her in the boardroom even once. It had been happening gradually, the three of them becoming something that functioned like a unit without either adult formally deciding it should. Sunday dinners at Liam's small apartment, Evelyn folding herself uncomfortably onto a secondhand couch that had seen better decades, insisting she preferred his cooking to the private chef who prepared her meals most nights. Weekend trips to the aquarium, the zoo, a children's museum downtown where Evelyn had stood patiently for 40 minutes while Maddie explained in exhaustive detail the entire life cycle of a butterfly. Evelyn teaching Maddie to play chess on a small travel set she kept in her office, losing on purpose at first, and then, as Maddie actually got good at it, losing for real and being genuinely delighted about it. "She's better than half my board," Evelyn told Liam one evening, setting up the pieces again after Maddie had gone to bed, the two of them sitting at his kitchen table with a bottle of wine between them that Evelyn had brought and Liam couldn't have afforded. "She thinks 3 moves ahead. I respect that in a person, regardless of their age." "She gets that from her mother," Liam said quietly. It still happened sometimes, those small, unguarded mentions of his late wife, and Evelyn had learned over the months exactly how to receive them. Not with the careful, anxious sympathy of someone afraid of saying the wrong thing, but with the easy attentiveness of someone who understood that grief and love could occupy the same space without canceling each other out. "Tell me about her," Evelyn said. "If you want to." He did, sometimes. Small stories, the kind that didn't hurt as much in the telling as they used to. How his wife, Sarah, used to sing terribly and on purpose just to make Maddie laugh. How she'd planned to be a teacher before the diagnosis. How she'd spent her last good months making Maddie's preschool teacher promise to read her a specific list of books every year. A promise the woman had apparently kept even after Sarah was gone. Evelyn listened to all of it without flinching, without trying to fix the parts that couldn't be fixed, the same quality Liam had loved in her from the very beginning, before he understood that he loved it, before he understood that what was growing between them had a name he hadn't been ready to say out loud. It was Evelyn who said it first, eventually, on a night in late autumn when the rain had finally stopped after a week straight, and the two of them sat on the small balcony of his apartment with blankets over their laps and Maddie asleep inside. "I need to tell you something," Evelyn said, "and I need you to let me say all of it before you respond, because if you interrupt me, I'll lose my nerve, and we'll be back here in another 3 months having this exact same conversation, and I don't think either of us has the patience for that." Liam, despite himself, smiled. "Okay. I am 55 years old, you are 32. I am aware of every single thing that comparison implies, and I've spent a fairly embarrassing amount of time lying awake calculating exactly how it looks to other people, how it will look in the press if it ever becomes public, what my board will say, what your daughter's teachers will say when they find out, what strangers on the internet will absolutely have something to say about, because apparently I've become a person strangers on the internet have opinions about now." She took a breath, "And I've decided I don't care about any of it nearly as much as I care about the fact that for the first time in 5 years, longer than that, if I'm honest with myself, longer than the accident, I feel like a person worth knowing instead of a problem to be managed. And you did that. Not because you pitied me, not because you wanted something from me, because you looked at me and you kept looking every single day in a way nobody else in my entire adult life has bothered to." She turned to face him fully, the porch light catching the scarring along her jaw, and Liam thought, not for the first time, that it had stopped registering to him as anything other than simply part of her face, the same way a birthmark or a laugh line would. "I love you," Evelyn said. "I've known it for months and been too much of a coward to say it, which is somewhat embarrassing for a woman who stood on a stage in front of 3,000 strangers and took off her scarf. Apparently this is harder." Liam didn't say anything right away, and for a moment something flickered across Evelyn's face. Not quite panic, but close to it. The particular fear of a person who'd just handed over something fragile and was waiting to see if it would be dropped. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this without sounding like I was just waiting for an opening," Liam finally said. "I love you too. I think I have for a while. Maybe since the gala, if I'm being honest, which probably sounds insane, because it was 3 minutes and a dance and I didn't even know your last name yet at that point." "It doesn't sound insane," Evelyn said, her voice unsteady in a way it almost never was. I think I fell in love with you over the course of one song, too. I've just had more practice hiding things than you have. He reached over and took her hand, the same way he had on that dance floor almost a year earlier, except this time there was no audience, no orchestra, no 300 strangers holding their breath. Just the two of them on a small balcony with the city lights spread out below. The rain finally stopped, his daughter asleep inside in the small life he'd built out of nothing but stubbornness and love. For what it's worth, Liam said, I don't care about the age thing either. People can say whatever they want. I know exactly who you are. The board, the internet, all of it. None of that's ever once been the truth of you. I am. It wasn't, of course, that simple once the relationship became public. Nothing involving Evelyn Harrington's life had stayed simple in over a year, but the response, when a photographer caught the two of them having dinner at a quiet restaurant downtown, and the story broke a week later, was different than either of them had braced for. There was speculation, certainly, the kind of tabloid attention that came with dating a billionaire CEO, questions about whether Liam was after her money, snide comments about the age gap that Evelyn had predicted with uncomfortable accuracy. But underneath the noise, something else emerged too, a wave of genuine public affection, people who'd watched her Chicago speech and felt invested in some strange parasocial way in seeing her happy. The foundation's social media accounts, normally dedicated to grant announcements and survivor stories, were flooded with comments wishing them well. A burn survivor Liam had mentored through the program wrote an open letter, published without either of their knowledge, about what it meant to watch the woman who'd funded his recovery find love without hiding any part of herself to get there. Even some of the same outlets that had run the Cruel Finance blog piece a year earlier published soft, almost apologetic pieces about Evelyn's remarkable personal and professional renaissance. The board, for the most part, kept quiet. A few members made vague comments about personal matters not affecting the company's performance, which, given the foundation's expanded reach and Harrington Global's continued strong quarterly numbers, was difficult to argue with even for the people inclined to try. The man who'd called her appearance an optics situation the year before requested, awkwardly, to be photographed shaking Liam's hand at the company's holiday party, which Evelyn found so darkly funny she nearly choked on her wine telling Liam about it later. Maddie, for her part, took the news of her father's relationship with the calm satisfaction of someone whose predictions had finally, obviously, come true. I told you, she said, when Liam sat her down to explain carefully that he and Evelyn were officially together now, that Evelyn would probably be around even more than before, that this was a big change, and if Maddie had any feelings about it, good or complicated, she could say so. I told you at dinner, with the chicken. You did, Liam admitted. You were right. I'm always right, Maddie said, with the breathtaking confidence of the very young, and then immediately undercut the whole performance by asking, in a smaller voice, does this mean she's going to be around forever? Like, not just visiting? Liam knelt down to her level, the way he always did for the questions that mattered most. I don't know about forever, baby. Nobody knows that for sure about anything. But I know she loves you, and I know she's not going anywhere on purpose. That's about as close to a promise as I can honestly make you. Maddie considered this with the gravity of a much older person weighing a contract. Okay, she finally said. But she has to come to my next recital too, even the boring one in the spring where I'm just in the back row. I think, Liam said, smiling, that she'd want to come to that one most of all. The mentorship program continued to grow through that winter, expanding into 4 additional cities by the following spring, and Liam found himself, almost without noticing the transition, becoming something the Foundation's annual report eventually called a leading voice in trauma-informed survivor advocacy, a phrase that made him laugh out loud the first time he read it, because in his own head, he was still just the guy who used to pour champagne at the Hawthorne Grand and couldn't quite believe anyone had decided his opinion on anything mattered. Evelyn, meanwhile, had become something the press had taken to calling, with a mixture of admiration and slight disbelief. The most visible CEO in America, a complete reversal from the woman who'd avoided cameras for 5 straight years. She gave interviews now on her own terms, spoke at conferences when the cause mattered to her, and had stopped entirely wearing the silk scarves that used to be a permanent fixture of her wardrobe. She still had hard days, moments, usually late at night, when old insecurities surfaced and she needed Liam to simply sit with her without trying to talk her out of the feeling, the same way she'd once sat with him through stories about Sarah. But the hard days came less often, and when they came, they didn't last as long. What struck Liam most, watching the two of them build something neither had expected over the course of that year, wasn't the scale of it. The headlines, the foundation's growth, the strange new visibility that had reshaped both their lives. It was the small things. The way Evelyn had memorized, without ever being told, that Maddie liked her sandwiches without crust. The way Liam had learned, slowly, which of Evelyn's silences needed company and which needed space. The way the two of them had built, out of a single reckless dance at a gala neither of them had wanted to attend, something that looked less like a fairy tale and more like the slow, deliberate work of two imperfect people choosing each other, over and over. On ordinary days, nobody was watching. By the time the Hawthorne Group sent out invitations for the following year's Legacy Charity Gala, the same ballroom, the same chandeliers, the same orchestra that had played the night everything started, Liam Brooks and Evelyn Harrington had built a year's worth of quiet, unglamorous, deeply earned love between them, the kind that had nothing left to prove to anyone watching and everything left to celebrate with the people who mattered most. The invitation arrived on heavy cream cardstock, the Hawthorne Group's crest embossed in gold at the top, and Liam turned it over twice in his hands before setting it on the kitchen counter next to a stack of Maddie's school worksheets, struck by how strange it felt to receive something like that as an actual guest, instead of finding it folded into a staff schedule with his shift times printed beneath it. "You're staring at that like it's going to bite you," Evelyn said, coming up behind him still in her coat, having let herself in with the key he'd given her 3 months earlier, an event that had felt, at the time, far more significant than either of them admitted out loud. "Last time I was in that ballroom, I almost got fired for crossing the floor," Liam said. "Forgive me if the building gives me a little bit of a complex." "You didn't almost get fired. Dale told me himself, months later, that he'd already decided not to fire you before you even sat down in his office. He just wanted to make you sweat a little first. Apparently it's some kind of management philosophy he's very proud of." Evelyn slid her arms around him from behind, resting her chin on his shoulder, looking down at the invitation. "Besides, this year you're not staff. This year, you're my date." "Your date," Liam repeated. "That still sounds insane to say out loud." Get used to it," Evelyn said. "I intend to keep saying it for a very long time." The year since the last gala had reshaped both their lives in ways neither could have fully predicted standing in that same ballroom 12 months earlier. The mentorship program Liam had started with a handful of survivors in Seattle now operated in 9 cities, with a waiting list long enough that the foundation had begun training additional mentors just to keep pace with demand. Evelyn's visibility, once a source of boardroom anxiety, had become something closer to a competitive advantage. Harrington Global's stock had climbed steadily through the year, and more than one analyst had pointed, somewhat sheepishly, to the company's reputation for authentic leadership as part of the reason why. But the bigger changes were smaller than any of that. Maddie had lost her first tooth and insisted on showing it to Evelyn before she even told her teacher. Liam had stopped flinching, mostly, when people recognized him in public now, stopped bracing for the assumption that he was only with Evelyn for her money, an assumption that still occasionally surfaced in comment sections and tabloid sidebars, but had largely been drowned out by a year of evidence to the contrary. Evelyn had stopped wearing scarves entirely, had started, in fact, wearing necklaces that drew the eye toward her collarbone and jaw rather than away from it. A small private rebellion against 5 years of trying to disappear. And quietly, in the months leading up to the gala, Liam had started carrying something in his coat pocket that he hadn't told Evelyn about yet. A small velvet box he'd bought from a jeweler 2 streets down from the foundation's offices. After weeks of deliberation and one entirely unhelpful but enthusiastic consultation with his 7-year-old daughter, who had strong opinions about diamonds, despite having never owned anything more valuable than a friendship bracelet. "It has to sparkle a lot," Maddie had instructed, examining photos on his phone with the seriousness of a jewel appraiser. "Evelyn likes things that sparkle, but not like too sparkly. She's not extra like that." "She's not extra like that," Liam had repeated, amused. "Got it. Noted." The night of the gala arrived cold and clear. None of the rain that had soaked the city the year before. and Liam stood in front of his bedroom mirror adjusting a bow tie that fit considerably better than the rented one he'd worn as staff 12 months earlier, while Mrs. Alvarez fussed over Maddie in the next room, getting her ready for the special sleepover she'd been promised as a reward for letting her father have a grown-up night out. "You look nervous," Maddie observed, appearing in his doorway in her pajamas, watching him struggle with the tie for the third time. "I am nervous," Liam admitted. "Why?" "You already danced with her once. You're good at it now." He laughed, kneeling down to her level, smoothing her hair the way he did when he needed a second to gather himself. "Tonight's a little different, baby. Are you going to ask her to marry you?" Maddie's eyes went enormous, and Liam realized too late that there was no version of this conversation where a 7-year-old kept that information to herself for the rest of the evening. "Maybe," he said carefully. "Can you keep a secret?" Maddie nodded so hard her whole body moved with it. "I'm the best secret keeper in my whole class. Ask anyone." "Then yeah," Liam said. "Maybe I am." She threw her arms around his neck with enough force to nearly knock him backward, and he held her there for a long moment, breathing in the smell of her shampoo, thinking about how far they'd both come from the apartment with the water-stained ceiling and the bus rides home from shifts that paid just enough to keep the lights on. He thought about Sarah the way he still did sometimes in quiet moments like this one, not with the raw grief of the early years, but with something gentler now, something closer to gratitude, for the years they'd had, for the daughter she'd left him, for the fact that somewhere along the way he'd learned how to let love back in without it feeling like a betrayal of what he'd lost. He thought she would have liked Evelyn. He thought she would have liked, especially the way Evelyn never once tried to replace her, never performed a version of motherhood that wasn't hers to perform, just showed up consistently and let Maddie decide in her own time how much room there was for someone new. The Hawthorne Grand Ballroom looked exactly as it had the year before. The same chandeliers throwing fractured light across the marble floor, the same orchestra tuning quietly in the corner, the same crowd of Seattle's wealthiest gathering beneath gold-leafed ceilings. And yet everything about walking into it felt entirely different. Liam moved through the room not with a tray balanced on one hand, but with Evelyn's arm linked through his, and the same guests who had averted their eyes from her a year earlier now approached with genuine warmth, congratulating her on the Foundation's expanded reach, asking after the mentorship program, treating her, finally, fully, like exactly what she'd always been, the most formidable woman in the room. Dale found them near the bar within the first 20 minutes, looking almost unrecognizable out of his usual harried event coordinator mode, dressed in a tuxedo and holding a glass of champagne with the relaxed posture of someone who'd finally stopped sweating the seating chart. "Brooks," he said, shaking Liam's hand with what looked like genuine pleasure. "Last year you nearly gave me a heart attack in this exact room. I want that on the record." "Duly noted," Liam said, smiling. "For what it's worth," Dale added, lowering his voice slightly, glancing at Evelyn, who'd been pulled momentarily into conversation with one of the Foundation's major donors a few feet away. "I've worked 100 of these events. I've never seen anything like what happened on this floor last year. I still don't fully understand it, but whatever it is you two have, it's the realest thing I've watched happen in this ballroom in 11 years of doing this job." He raised his glass slightly. "Don't waste it." "I don't intend to," Liam said, and meant it more than Dale could have known. The evening unfolded with a kind of warmth that the gala, in all its polished formality, didn't usually accommodate. Evelyn gave brief remarks before dinner about the Foundation's growth over the past year, her voice steady and unhurried, no notes in front of her, no scarf at her neck, the scarring along her jaw simply part of the room, the way the chandeliers and the gold leaf were part of the room. Present, unremarkable, no longer the thing anyone's eyes snagged on first. She spoke about the mentorship program by name, about the survivors who'd found their way back to themselves through it, and at one point, without warning, she gestured toward Liam at his table and told the room simply that none of it would exist without a man who'd once crossed this exact floor when no one else would. The applause that followed was warmer than anything Liam had ever experienced in his life, and he sat there, slightly stunned, while Evelyn returned to her seat beside him and squeezed his hand under the table like she understood exactly how much that moment had cost him to sit through gracefully. "You didn't warn me you were going to do that," he murmured. "I wanted to see your face," Evelyn said, entirely unrepentant. "It was worth it," But dinner gave way eventually to dancing, and the orchestra began the same kind of slow waltz that had opened the floor the year before. The deliberate choice, Liam suspected, of an events team that understood exactly what story this gala was now associated with, whether they admitted it publicly or not. Couples began moving toward the center of the room, and Liam felt his pulse pick up, the small velvet box in his coat pocket suddenly feeling enormous, impossible to ignore. "Walk with me," Evelyn said before he could say anything himself, taking his hand and leading him toward the same stretch of floor by the tall windows where she'd once stood alone for nearly an hour while the whole room pretended not to notice her. She turned to face him there, in almost the exact spot, the city lights of Seattle glittering through the glass behind her, and something in her expression told Liam she'd been planning this moment with as much care as he had, though neither of them had said a word about it to the other. "A year ago," Evelyn said, "I stood right here and decided I was going to leave this party early, slip out a side door before anyone noticed I'd never danced at all. I had the whole exit planned, and then a waiter who had absolutely no business doing what he did crossed this entire floor and changed the rest of my life." Her voice wavered slightly, the careful CEO composure cracking just enough to let something rawer through. "I used to think the accident was the thing that defined me. The fire, the scars, the 5 years I spent disappearing because I didn't know how to exist in a world that kept flinching at me. But I don't think that's true anymore. I think the thing that actually defined me was the choice to keep standing in rooms even when it would have been easier not to. And you're the reason I remembered I was capable of that choice." Liam reached into his coat pocket, and Evelyn went very still, watching his hand with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and a hope she clearly hadn't let herself fully feel until that exact second. "I've been carrying this around for 3 weeks, Liam admitted, opening the small box to reveal a ring that was exactly as Maddie had instructed, enough to sparkle without being too much. "I kept waiting for the right moment, and then I realized there isn't going to be a more right moment than the place where this whole thing started." He knelt, right there on the marble floor, in front of the same windows, in front of a ballroom, slowly turning to watch. "Evelyn Harrington, I am 33 years old. I have a 7-year-old daughter who already approved of you a year before I had the nerve to admit how I felt, and I would very much like to spend the rest of my life proving to you, every single day, that you never have to disappear again. Will you marry me?" The ballroom had gone fully silent now, the orchestra faltering slightly before the conductor, understanding the moment unfolding in front of him, gestured for the musicians to keep playing softly, a quiet undercurrent rather than a stop. Evelyn looked down at Liam, her eyes bright with tears. She didn't bother trying to blink back this time, no iron discipline left to hold them in, and for a moment she simply stood there, overwhelmed, while 300 guests held their collective breath the same way they had a year earlier. "Yes," she finally said, her voice breaking on the single word, and then louder, laughing through the tears now. "Yes, obviously yes. Get up here and kiss me before I start crying in front of my entire board." He did, and the ballroom erupted. Not the stunned, scandalized silence of the year before, but genuine, overwhelming applause, glasses raised, several guests visibly wiping their own eyes, Dale somewhere near the back actually whooping in a way that violated every professional standard he'd ever held Liam to. The orchestra swelled into the full waltz, and Liam pulled Evelyn into his arms right there, the two of them dancing in the exact spot where this entire impossible story had begun. Except this time there was no hesitation in the room, no cowardice, no calculated distance, just 300 people watching two imperfect, ordinary, extraordinary people choose each other in front of everyone, with nothing left to hide. They danced for the rest of the night, through songs neither of them fully registered, through congratulations from people Evelyn had known for decades, and people Liam had only just met, through champagne toasts and Dale's genuinely emotional speech about having a front row seat to the only good thing that's ever happened in this ballroom besides the open bar. At some point, Evelyn pulled out her phone and video called Mrs. Alvarez's apartment, and Maddie's sleepy, delighted face filled the screen when she heard the news, immediately demanding to know if she got to be in the wedding and whether she could pick her own dress. Questions Evelyn answered with the patient seriousness of someone already deeply, permanently invested in being this child's family. It would be easy telling a story like this one to end it there. The proposal, the applause, the happy ending wrapped up neatly in a ballroom under chandeliers, the kind of ending that closes a book and lets everyone go home satisfied. But the truth of what Liam and Evelyn built together was never really about the gala, or the proposal, or even the love story itself, as remarkable as it was. It was about something quieter and harder to capture in a single dramatic moment. It was about the year that followed, the unglamorous day-to-day work of building a life together. Evelyn learning to braid Maddie's hair badly and laughing at her own incompetence instead of being embarrassed by it. Liam learning to navigate boardrooms and press events with the same steady presence he'd once brought to a dance floor, never quite losing the instinct that had gotten him there in the first place. The simple refusal to look away from people the world had decided weren't worth looking at. It was about the wedding itself. 8 months later, small and unglamorous by Harrington Global standards, held not in some grand venue, but in the Foundation's community garden, with survivors from the mentorship program seated alongside board members, with Maddie as flower girl insisting on wearing sneakers under her dress, because, in her own words, weddings are long and my feet matter too. It was about the mentorship program continuing to grow long after the headlines about Evelyn's engagement faded, quietly changing lives in cities neither Liam nor Evelyn would ever personally visit, run now by people Liam had trained who carried forward the same simple philosophy he'd built it on. That dignity isn't something you earn back after tragedy. It's something that was never actually lost, just temporarily obscured by other people's discomfort. It was about Evelyn, years later, sitting across from a young CEO at another company who'd reached out after her own public struggle with how the press covered a visible disability, asking Evelyn how she'd found the courage to stop hiding. And Evelyn telling her, honestly, that courage wasn't really the right word for it, that what she'd actually found was a single person willing to walk toward her when an entire room walked away, and that the real lesson wasn't about her own bravery at all. It was about how much it costs a society when its instinct, faced with someone who looks different or has been marked by tragedy, is to look away instead of forward. It was about how rare and how necessary it is to have even one person refuse to do that, and how that one refusal, multiplied across enough rooms and enough years, was the only thing that had ever actually changed anything. Liam thought about this often. In the years that followed, watching his daughter grow into a teenager who'd inherited both her late mother's quick wit and her stepmother's quiet steel, watching Evelyn continue to run one of the country's most respected companies without a single scarf or careful camera angle, watching the mentorship program he'd started in a cramped office with nothing but good intentions and his own hard-earned understanding of what it meant to be overlooked, grow into something that had touched thousands of lives he'd never personally meet. He thought about the version of himself who'd stood at the edge of that ballroom a year before any of it began, exhausted, underpaid, certain that crossing the floor was probably going to cost him a job he desperately needed. He thought about how easy it would have been to stay where he was supposed to stay, to keep pouring water at table 9, to let the moment pass the way it had passed for every other man in that room who'd quietly decided Evelyn Harrington wasn't worth the risk. He never regretted, not for a single day afterward, choosing differently. True courage, he'd come to understand, rarely announced itself with trumpets or grand gestures. Most of the time it looked exactly like what it had looked like that night. An ordinary, tired man putting down a tray he couldn't really afford to set aside and walking toward someone the rest of the world had decided to walk away from. It looked like choosing compassion in the one moment everyone else chose silence, not because it was easy, not because the outcome was guaranteed, but because the alternative, staying quiet, staying safe, staying invisible, had never once, in the whole of human history, made anyone's life better. Evelyn, for her part, came to understand something different but equally important over those years. That the dance had never really been about romance, not at its core, not in that very first moment when Liam's hand found hers under the chandeliers. It had been about dignity, about a woman who'd spent 5 years believing the world's discomfort with her scars was a debt she owed, an apology she had to keep paying, finally being shown that she'd never owed anyone anything at all. That her worth had never actually diminished the day the fire changed her face. It had only ever been other people's fear that made it look that way. And Maddie, who grew up watching her father and her stepmother build a life out of one impossibly brave choice, who grew up understanding, in a way most children never get the chance to learn so directly, that the people worth loving aren't always the ones the world applauds first. That sometimes the most important thing you can do in a crowded room is simply notice the person everyone else has decided not to. Maddie carried that lesson with her long after she'd grown too old for bedtime stories and butterfly facts, long after the ring her father had shown her in secret became a wedding photograph on the living room wall. Long after the gala that started, everything had become, simply, the story of how her family began. Years later, when she was old enough to understand the full shape of it, she asked her father once why he'd really crossed that floor, whether he'd known, even a little, that it would change everything. "No," Liam told her honestly. "I had no idea what it would turn into. I just knew that watching everyone walk away from her felt wrong, and I couldn't make myself be one more person who did that." He'd thought about it for a moment longer, looking out at the same Seattle skyline that had watched over the whole story from its beginning. I think that's usually how the important choices work, honestly. You rarely know in the moment that they're going to matter. You just know, somewhere underneath all your fear and your tiredness and every reason you have to mind your own business, that it's the right thing to do. And you do it anyway. The rest of it, all of it, everything that came after, that was never really the plan. It was just what happens when you refuse to look away. The Harrington Foundation continued its work for decades after that night, long after the headlines faded and the viral clips were forgotten, quietly funding burn treatment and survivor mentorship and emergency responder support in cities across the country, carrying forward the same simple principle that had started it all in a Seattle ballroom: that love, respect, and human dignity were never, despite what the world sometimes insisted, limited by scars or age or the cruel, careless calculations of people too afraid to walk across a room. And every year on the anniversary of that first gala, Evelyn and Liam returned to the same ballroom, stood in the same spot by the same tall windows, and danced to the same slow waltz the orchestra had learned by then to simply expect, not because the moment needed repeating, but because some moments are worth returning to on purpose, year after year, as a reminder of exactly how much can change when one person decides that compassion is worth more than comfort and chooses, against every easy instinct telling them not to cross the floor anyway.